The economic boom and the development of democracy in Sweden has gone hand in hand with reforms which made life easier to live. In Swedish history we speak of the so-called people's home, a society in which all inhabitants are supposed to feel welcome and where no one needs to beg to survive. To achieve that, however, requires comprehensive reforms to attack the roots of poverty and to eliminate ancient injustices that prevented people from achieving their dreams. The first wave of reforms that paved the way for modern Sweden came in the 1840s, even though the country was one of the poorest in Europe at the time. This development was headed by the second king of the House of Bernadotte, Oscar I, who was born in Paris in 1799 and had accompanied his father, Jean-Baptiste, to Sweden. During his long time as crown prince, Oscar was one of Sweden's leading advocates of liberal reforms. It was he who put forward the proposal for general and compulsory elementary schooling, which was introduced in 1842. And in 1847, when he had become king, he took the initiative for a poor relief ordinance. It was thereby established for the first time in Swedish history that society has a social obligation to help the poor. He also acted resolutely against the appalling conditions in prisons, a topic on which he wrote an influential book. In matters of equality between the sexes, Oscar I is likewise an innovator in Swedish history. In 1845 he ensured that equal inheritance rights for women were introduced. In 1858 that unmarried women became legally competent. By far his most important reform was the introduction of freedom of trade in 1846, a memorable year in Swedish economic history. Yet the truly great steps towards making Sweden into a land of welfare were not taken until a century later, between the 1930s and the 1950s. To generalize, one can say that there were two major causes: the steadily improving national economy, which meant that the government could afford expensive reforms, and the consensus that prevailed between political parties and between the parties on the labour market. The consensus could not be taken for granted, however. In 1909 Sweden had suffered a general strike, and in 1931 the army opened fire on demonstrators in Ådalen. But all of this changed between 1932 and 1938. In 1932 the Social Democrats began to cooperate with the Farmers' League, the centre-right party representing agricultural interests. In the past the parties had been enemies, but when they buried the hatchet, the politicians discovered that they had many shared interests. This resulted in stronger governments and the ability to force through radical reforms to raise living standards for ordinary people. In 1938, peace was also concluded between representatives of the trade unions and the employers. They agreed that wage talks would henceforth be held in a spirit of mutual understanding. The number of strikes and lockouts fell sharply as a result. With that, the foundation had been laid for what has become known internationally as the Swedish model, a successful third way between capitalism and socialism. From the cradle to the grave, Swedes were surrounded by a social safety net. A typical example is child allowance, introduced in 1937 and greatly increased in 1948, since when the state has paid allowances to all families with children. At the same time, old people received increasingly generous pensions, and in 1955 a Sickness Insurance Act was passed, guaranteeing financial compensation to those who became so ill that they could not work. School was reformed as well. In 1962, the old elementary school from 1842 was replaced by compulsory 9-year schooling. After these 9 years, pupils could go on to high school, but few took advantage of this possibility at first. Today, however, attending high school is almost as natural as going to compulsory school. The reforms were also intended to give people more leisure time so that they could improve their minds and bodies. Paid holidays were therefore introduced in 1938. All Swedes had the right to 2 weeks paid holiday each year. A third holiday week was added in 1951, a fourth in 1963 and a fifth in 1978. Already in the 1930s, the state started educational campaigns to get people to use their holiday time well. Sports and leisure organizations encouraged people to get out into the fresh air and the countryside when they were not working. At first this went slowly, but when wages rose, people's habits changed. Swedes became a nature-loving and sporting people. The kings did not actively participate in the whole of this reform package, since their political position was much weaker than that of their predecessors in the 19th century. But they were wholeheartedly in favor of the reforms, and they liked to set a good example, not least in sports and outdoor life. A good example is the father of the present king, Prince Gustav Adolf, who never mounted the throne because he died prematurely in a plane crash. Gustav Adolf was Swedish champion many times over in saber fencing and won numerous competitions in riding, eventing, dressage and show jumping, and he competed in the Olympic Games in 1936. Like his son, Carl XVI Gustav, he was an active promoter of the scouting movement.